Welcome to the Executive Seminar on Enterprise Agility and COVID Response. I'm Joe Justice, the founder of the Agile Business Institute and founder of Team WIKISPEED. You may have seen the TEDx video that WIKISPEED has put together where I was the presenter, and you may have seen Team WIKISPEED on primetime news around the world. Here's a clip from Bay Area News, Silicon Valley News, where we were on the mainstream news at prime time for building a car in one day. In that case, it was with Lockheed Martin Space Systems, where they'd used us to train their Agile teams and Agile executives. The work that I'm going to try to condense here for all of us has been featured on Good Morning America, the Today Show, Fox News, the Asahi Shimbun, the Nikkei in Japan, for what I've experienced. And that includes being the author of the Scrum Hardware Guide, the chair of the Agile Business Institute, and the creator of the Extreme Manufacturing Methods. I landed at the Seattle airport 2.5 weeks ago from Tokyo. I'd left Switzerland on one of the last flights out before there was a mandatory 2-week quarantine, and I arrived in Tokyo. And then I was able to depart Tokyo on one of the last flights out before there was a mandatory 2-week quarantine. And I filmed this video clip right when I landed in the Seattle airport.
Happy birthday, Sana. It's Papa. I just arrived in Seattle in the United States, and I would love to see you and play with you for your birthday. Papa wants to make sure he's not sick, so he's going to stay, I think, at Aunt Debbie and Uncle G's house for 2 weeks above their garage where he's not so close to anybody in case he's sick, to not share germs. I'm making the video right now because I just landed, and right now I feel great, but I'm about to put a mask on so nobody would even see my face.
My daughter turned 6 the day I landed. That's why I flew back. That's why it was so important for me to get back. And COVID became very real for me. I was advised and took the advice to stay in quarantine for 2 weeks. I didn't see her at all for her birthday. Instead, I went to this COVID test center. I was really impressed with how it was set up. There was a tent, a vinyl tent set up in the parking lot with a row of, it looked standard 8.5 by 11 or A4 paper sized signs directing me of where to drive, and then not even get out of the car. And I rolled down the window of the car, and the side of the vinyl tent opened, and there were several medical staff wearing scrubs further back in the tent with a heater, just like you'd have at an outside cafe. One of them was in full protective gear with a face shield, a face mask, a hairnet, gloves, full scrubs, and booty covers. And judging from that woman's eyes, she was terrified. She appeared to be shaking. She walked up to me to the open car window and swabbed my nose. It was incredibly uncomfortable. It took what seemed like a small eternity, and I'm very glad she did. 4 days later, I received a phone call with my test results. I was not tested positive for COVID-19. However, I was advised to continue the 2-week quarantine because a low dose exposure when I was in the international airports might not have showed up on the test yet, and the tests weren't fully accurate. And my 3-year-old son has lung problems. He's asthmatic, it seems. So I was encouraged to continue my quarantine. What I experienced in this is that Seattle, Washington was one of the first high growth areas for coronavirus, or the greater Washington area, high spread areas. And seeing the rapidity of the rollout of the response there, the light lift affordable way, and the fact that they'd created a side building, a drive-through test center, to avoid cross-contamination with the main medical center and trying to continue normal medical operations impressed me. And I was dumbfounded to see international news of many places, many areas all around the world not able to set up test centers, not having enough tests, and shocked that it was still very difficult even in Seattle. In Japan, when I'd been in Tokyo just earlier that day, I was not allowed to have a coronavirus test unless I'd had a fever over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, they used a Celsius equivalent, for more than 4 days. So without that, I couldn't even be tested, which of course suppresses the number of tested coronavirus responses coming out of Japan. This led me to be very interested in rapid construction techniques for these coronavirus testing centers. And the tent setup seemed to be the most affordable and most rapid. I was seeing traditional architecture firms try to pivot. And interestingly, I was seeing them take on exactly the same principle Team WIKISPEED had. Here is a rapid deployable medical center component as a repeatable module. So this module can be mass produced, they're configurable internally, they can be deployed and redeployed because the modules are sized to fit on United States roadways, which is a 8 foot 6 inch, sorry for the imperial measurement, maximum width. And the length actually varies on the state you're in, but typically 40 feet long is standard accepted. So these structures are built this way, able to be deployed and then redeployed to different areas as needed. And I commented here, looking great, modular and redeployable, road legal size or smaller, makes for some of the best agility in construction. Fastest deploy and iteration, improvement speeds can be one of the lowest cost methods too, depending on how the design, test, and manufacturing is organized. For example, Scrum hardware and material and tool selection XM. They were able to, this construction company was able to respond to demand in 3 weeks in construction for hospital components. Now, remember, hospitals in the US and most of the world had been taking multiple years or even decades to get the correct approvals, government alignments, maximize incentives, and deploy. They had no ability to use that method when response time was highly important, which is the case of this current crisis. An earlier abstract for the draft version of this talk included management principles of how to best deal with austerity from the 16 years of consulting that I've been doing with companies around the world, including many of the top companies in Tokyo for the last year. What's important, I believe, now for this COVID environment is many mid-level, senior, and top leadership people are being asked to cope with a dramatically smaller budget and being told to lay off staff. What to do? What have I possibly learned in the consulting world and focusing on agile and respect for people and on building morale in order to accelerate delivery and ability to pivot and resilience in a crisis? What have I possibly learned that could help there? Well, here's what I'm going to try to hit very quickly for the COVID response teams that'll be watching this in the recording. How are we going to lay people off? Well, it looks like if you want to preserve morale, which is the company's resilience and ability to innovate quickly during a crisis or even normal times, is you can't lay people off. Even minor layoffs crater morale. This has been measured by many industries in my own work, and all velocity goes down significantly. In fact, it stops in many areas. So if you want to be able to respond as a business, you can't. Well, then what do we do as leaders when we have a dramatic reduction in income, like most companies around the world are experiencing right now? As a leader, we have to be, interestingly, the Agile principles work here, and as do the Scrum principles, where we have transparency and focus and respect for people and customer collaboration over contract negotiation. What works here is being transparent about the money coming in, which is very frightening for many types of leaders. Let me try to explain how this can work in everyone's favor. By saying, here's the money we have coming in. It is, for example, 10% of the money we had on average each month the last operating year. I need a collaborative plan on how we're going to spend this money because this is all we have. It's only 10% of what it was. By engaging your workforce transparently, morale stays higher. Yes, there are some people that'll just be too terrified, too panicked to feel calm. But in general, the morale response is far smoother and less of a drop. In fact, it can even lead to morale building. I'll try to explain that case right now because this is a very important leadership aspect in the current crisis. We take the current income that's coming in and divide it across the highest important projects. So many of these are now COVID response essential operations, which are different than most companies were doing now. General Motors, for example, is now attempting to build ventilators. Toyota Manufacturing is now attempting to build face shields. Tesla is now building and is on version 2 of their ventilators. So these are not products that they were building previously. So these are pivots. So the new top priority projects are likely new projects, or at least new to the people who are about to take them on. All other projects drop off, they're stopped immediately. The existing income, any amount that's left, for example, 10% of previous income, is then distributed across the top projects and top projects only. Then the collaborative conversation happens saying, did we get the wrong top projects? Otherwise, we only have innovation from the top and we miss innovation from the bottom. The method to run this is best written by Jim Copeland in what's called Metascrum. That scenario happens, although the part I'll add to Metascrum is it's an intentional solicit of innovation from all ranks in the company and vetted by the senior leadership team, if there even is one. Some companies are so flat they don't have a senior leadership team. But for example, if you do, this is how it runs. The end state of that meeting is the very narrow top strategic initiatives, projects, or services have been identified, and the existing funds has been allocated across only those. Then everyone in the company is invited. Which of these do you want to work on? And now make your plan of how to distribute that income across as your payment. The payment is unlocked at key milestones, and those milestones are only functionality that's observed in the market. There's no funding released when planning is done. There's no funding released when testing is booked. It's only when functional aspects are distributed to the market. That creates the incentive for small slices of independent valuable projects. And this is exactly where Eric Ries's Lean Startup fits perfectly in how to split these chunks. So how to cut costs and not destroy morale, fund projects or goals, not people. Ask the teams to help you divide the funding across as many people as they usefully can to be fully dedicated to that project. Distribute the funding as tests pass. Next, how are we going to release faster? How are we going to accelerate our response time? Well, that's the time to go from making a decision to producing a new outcome, maybe a product. For many of these companies, they're ventilators, face shields, hospital gowns, gloves, booties, and that's called a sprint. And a lot of companies, it's 7 years or longer. Our response can't be faster than our supply chain. Traditional supply chain management was bonused only by reducing cost. That's got to change in crisis time. In fact, it should probably change in non-crisis time. But if we don't change it in crisis time, we won't be able to respond to the crisis, and the company goes out of business, becomes irrelevant, or is damaged. If a critical supplier takes 4 months in ideal times and 18 months in emergency times, our volume response cannot be faster than 18 months during a crisis. So we'll use the extreme manufacturing engineering practices, which I'll briefly highlight. And note, in most companies, how we make our strategic procurement decisions is a top management decision. It's how the entire procurement group is incentivized, if you still have a procurement group. This also works if procurement is distributed across all teams, which is a modern agile practice. But if you have a procurement group that's separate, or regardless how procurement is validated, the incentive is pivoted to speed of operations. For example, SpaceX. The Musk companies are the fastest agile hardware, software, and now COVID response companies that I'm aware of anywhere in the world. WIKISPEED was even faster before I rededicated my time to business consulting, executive management consulting. Looking at SpaceX, there's a wonderful picture from just 3 weeks ago of Starship 1, the prototype rocket to colonize Mars. And it has these landing legs on the side. And the information about the landing legs is they were the largest diameter steel pipe that an engineer at SpaceX could order online and have delivered within 48 hours. That was the decision-making criteria for procurement. And this is the lowest cost, highest lifting, fastest iterating, highly complex system on the planet right now by many measures. This is the new supply chain strategy. Now, please note there's some types of operations this rules out, that this eliminates. So if you want to respond quickly in COVID, we're not going to be relying on stamping and injection molding unless you're making your own tooling and doing your own injection molding like Toyota does. And I'll show that exception in a moment. It also means we're not going to be using many different types of materials or alloys to maximize the benefits of each aspect of the part. We'll be using standardized materials. For example, the Starship for SpaceX, it's one alloy. It's one alloy of steel across this massive rocket. Whereas Ariane Group, the Unified Launch Alliance, the rocket companies, systems, and government groups in China and Russia highly specialize alloy placement across the product to maximize the engineering benefit. As a result, those programs are years and decades long to get to one launchable product. SpaceX has an iteration every week, a rocket every week, that completely outpaces everyone else and knocks the cost out. And part of why is it's one alloy across the product, one alloy of steel. So it's a dramatic simplification of supply chain. This also is what unlocks the ability to collaborate across the engineering teams. They only need to know one alloy of steel. So learning how to machine, engineer, CAD, CAM, finite element analysis, computational fluid dynamics, one alloy of steel allows them to be cross-functional and do their own procurement. Next, how are we going to speed up release? We want to create a rhythm of making new priorities. That's typically weekly. In some really fast companies, it's daily. If your COVID response team wants to be highly responsive, you have a rhythm of this meta scrum pattern as Jim Copleen wrote it. And then the additional add is we directly solicit from all levels of the company, are these still the right top priorities? This also is where we redistribute funds, review if any projects have released their value into the market and then people actually get paid. This keeps morale high and keeps the focus on what seems just and fair, which according to Nikki Hare's analysis of the business effects of ethics and morale, boosts morale because of the perceived sense of justice by saying, we see how much money's coming in and we're getting paid only when we release the value to the market, which in this case is our COVID response. That means we have a rhythm of measuring the progress we can fund. A plan is not yet a solution. We want to split our crisis response into the smallest chunks we reasonably can, ideally day-sized, that actually improve the crisis situation. Toyota is measuring this on the number of masks received, face shields received by hospitals. That's their measure. That makes perfect sense. Tesla is measuring this on the number of ventilators received by hospitals. Now, both of these companies did something awesome, something very agile. They asked hospitals first, what do you need? When do you need them? How do you need them? And they continually re-ask. So they have involved the customer not just at the beginning and not just at the end, but throughout, which is a standard agile practice. And we're seeing mainstream hardware companies do this now, and it's the only way they can pivot within a crisis. Then accelerate the solution. For the leadership's teams, and this is standard management consulting, and this part works, ask what would speed up the team's rhythm. And we want to ask on a rhythm. This is an agile addition to standard management consulting practice. Asking on a rhythm prevents distracting or disrupting the teams. The teams want to focus and get stuff done. If they know the next time the leadership teams are going to engage and say, what help do you need? What are your impediments? The teams get used to this rhythm and it becomes less of a distraction and more of a morale build. Establishing a leadership coalition that monotasks one of these problems at a time until it's fixed is the fastest I've observed in the field to get these problems resolved. This is a high stress scenario. We want to knock stress out of this system. To do that, we instantiate a rhythm. The rhythm is public, has a clearly defined goal. The funding paychecks are directly tied to results, reasonable and just even in a crisis with heavily constrained funding. Progress is visible due to the small and variable initiative size. To solicit buy-in, we invite anyone to lobby for a higher priority. This again is done by through the Metascrum pattern as authored by Jim Copleen on a cadence and the justice of staff apportioning salary from the project funding budget, knowing funding is distributed only when outcomes are achieved. Then the extreme manufacturing practices. You've now established your COVID response team with a structure that can iterate quickly, solve problems quickly, distribute funding fairly, keep morale high, even if you've had to reduce funding by 90%. Now it's time to go fast. We do that through material selection, machine selection, cross-functional teams. I put colored name tags. I ask people if they're willing and interested to wear colored name tags, and I start by wearing one. There's a piece of white tape on the name tag that shows people have one essential skill. Yellow means they have another essential skill. Blue, green, brown. And those are all the essential skills. If my product requires more than that number of essential skills, I need to simplify my understanding of the product, like Tesla did on their ventilator, like SpaceX did on their rocket. So these are highly complex systems, and they're still simplified into very few specialties. Then if someone has all of these capabilities, they get a black piece of tape. They're a black belt. In my parlance, an extreme manufacturing black belt. And I wish for at least one of these black belts on every team of 4 to 6 people. When the company is scaled this way, that's compatible now with all the methods to scale Agile methods, group, Scrum, less, any of them. And you now have the expertise you need to respond to the crisis scenario as it evolves and as it's understood in every team. I highly recommend Paolo Samichelli's book, Scrum for Hardware. The first half of the book is the story of his and my life. Skip it for now. We're in a crisis. We don't have time for that. The second half of the book is the technical practices, the engineering practices to actually build stuff for response incredibly quickly. That's what you want. Read the second half. I highly recommend it. Now note, many engineering leads and design leads do not have authority or autonomy to mandate these practices, and serial, slow, multi-regression stage gate processes results as a default. So these must be executive mandates and checked, reinforced, reinstated. This is executive agility. So the executive team's job is to make sure we have few, say you're an engineering lead, your job is to make sure there are few types of engineering, few materials, few machines, short supplier lead times. And the executive's jobs is to make sure you're able to do that. That implies only using materials and machines that we can receive completed parts from in less than 7 days. There's 2 ways to attack that. One is to look off the shelf what machines and materials allow us to make parts in less than 7 days. The second way is, can we make new machines and new materials that give us a wider performance envelope and now make those better machines, better materials that are available in less than 7 days. Tesla did the first one. They took Tesla Model 3 car parts to make their ventilator. They were able to assemble it in less than 7 days, and they were on version 2 in 18 days. They had done that with FDA feedback, some FDA compliance, customer feedback. These are real done ventilators that improved the state of the art, not copies. Toyota has massive manufacturing skill. They made new molds. So instead of saying what existing machines allow us to meet the rapid cycle time, Toyota said, let's make new products, new machine parts that'll meet the cycle time. So depending on the expertise of your company, you can approach that each of the 2 different ways. This means we're going to be using commercial off-the-shelf products like Arduinos for electronics instead of customized circuit boards. We're definitely not going to be using customized coatings that often have a multi-week delay. Because if those are the standard supply chain delay time, 7 days or more, in a crisis, it could be 18 months or more, and we won't be able to respond in time. Then queue suppliers up to the interface of a module. Give them the test to pass and don't give the suppliers a detailed design. That way the suppliers innovate or can use off-the-shelf stock that we didn't know they had, or reuse designs that we don't know they have to solve the problem. So we say, here's the tests we need to pass, here's the interface it needs to meet, go. That type of RFP, an agile RFP, unlocks the innovation and avoids the penalties of micromanagement. Paolo Samichelli wrote 12 executive mandatable engineering practices, for example, designed for modularity so the organization can execute in massively parallel fashion. Architecture examples and principles are in his book, Scrum for Hardware. This has been documented over 1,000x speed increase across companies. These come from what my car company did, WIKISPEED, and we ultimately culminated at building cars, including new designs, in 27 minutes. Here's a set of Agile teams doing this. Here's principles for leadership teams. If there's a standard operating procedure for something, automate it. That's not the job of humans. This is another piece where speed comes from. Groups of humans are for all the stuff that doesn't have a standard operating procedure. And they're going to use agile methods with post-it notes on the whiteboard, or Atlassian Jira, or Scrummy, or Carica, or Miro. Here's Bosch. This is before crisis time, but I want to show that large companies are able to solve these problems. Bosch has hundreds of thousands of employees globally. And in this chunk of Bosch that I'm about to show you, there's no managers. They don't even need them anymore. They use the full agile utopia that many people see all around the world, where you have agile teams that are self-managing and self-reporting and have responsible self-funding practices based on release of value. Here's one of those teams. This team identified a problem in the market. It was on locomotives, so full-size freight engines. They took an off-the-shelf Bosch part, made a custom mount in 1 week, put it on a locomotive to get customer feedback. With that customer feedback, they started sprint 2, 3, 4, 5. You can see the hardware product evolve. These are all made in-house because supply chains were too long. They took too long. And they ended with the part on the far right at market in 5 weeks. The teams have to be able to make their own funding decisions. Otherwise, they have to wait on funding decisions from a legacy, slow company in most cases. That won't keep up in a crisis. So the teams have to know, here's the amount of money that comes in a week to my team. And we got to distribute that across salary and figure out what percentage of that is going to the actual hardware bits we're buying, or suppliers or vendors, etc. These teams run themselves like real companies. A lot of companies will call this the product owner or initiative owner role. Here's Toyota, 3 weeks from idea to tooled mass production with customer feedback. These are the face masks Toyota is making now, the face shields. They first 3D printed prototypes with customer feedback. Hospitals, asking hospitals, what do you need and how do you need them? Then they 3D printed tooling, so production tooling to start mass producing these things, the dies, the molds, the stamps. They used that until more durable tooling could be made. And the 3D printed tooling lasted until the more durable tooling arrived. Now, standard manufacturing process is to wait between all these states for final tooling. In a crisis, we can't. So here's how this company, Toyota, had parts made in 1 day with customer feedback, were in mass production within 3 weeks, and now they even have durable tooling, but they didn't wait for durable tooling. Ford is attempting to use the traditional manufacturing line model with vibrating or buzzing wristbands that let employees know if they're working too close, if they're closer than 2 meters from each other. This, with face masks, gloves, and goggles, they believe is enough to prevent COVID-19 from spreading across Ford's production lines. They're using this to respond in a crisis. So they're pivoting the way they manufacture. The fastest example I've seen is Tesla. And their stock price is showing that the market believes they're pivoting better than anyone else. Tesla's stock price spiked well above Toyota, Ford, GM, Chrysler. Not Toyota's market cap, but above Toyota's growth rate. Volkswagen Group. And everyone's stock dropped when COVID-19 came out. And then Tesla's response was exciting enough, the market grew for Tesla and not for any of the other companies I just mentioned. And here's why. Within 18 days, Tesla had developed a new ventilator. Now this is an entire ventilator. You see a picture at the bottom right from their Sprint demo, that Sprint 2 demo. That's on YouTube. You can watch it. The link is on this slide. They have a cross-functional team with testing in the same room as what appears to be fabrication and in the same room as design. That cross-functional team has real-time customer feedback, and they're developing and testing and designing in the same room with the same staff, so there's no wait states. This is the fastest method anyone is able to observe currently on rapid response, and it's exactly what Agile coaches, Agile trainers, Scrum masters all around the world have been doing for a few decades in software, and we're now seeing it become the only method that can keep up if there's a fast need for hardware. You see the timeline on the right. You see Tesla first bought in mass ventilators that were off the shelf, verified which hospitals wanted them, how they wanted them, delivered them. They had already started designing their own. They used parts they already had in-house, and you can see the Tesla Model 3 screen in the picture on the bottom right, which is the same screen in my Model 3 that I'm sitting in, running their ventilator software. Then next bit of executive recommendation is knock out all recurring expenses. If we have any leaseholds, any rents, we've got to jettison those immediately, if at all possible. So what I'm doing is I'm moving out of my house and living and working from my Tesla Model 3 race car. Before lockdown, I would drive that to different racetracks around the US, because this car's on the North American continent. And I'd participate in racing series, and then I'd sleep in the back, and then I would do my work using my cell phone as my mobile connection, and I would receive mail at mailing services that automatically scan the mail, deposit checks, and forward packages to the pickup location of my choice. That's allowed me to knock out tremendous amount of recurring expense from household mortgage, utility bills, etc. Not everyone wants to take that on. The point is to knock out recurring expenses. That's what we have to do to have the relaxed state to respond in a crisis. Let me try to rehash. If you're faced with the decision as a leader to knock out expenses, so you have 10% of the income you did last month or the last 12 months on average, which is a very real situation for most of the companies in the world. For example, almost every restaurant in the world is closed right now, for example. Some do takeout only, and that's it. That's an entire segment of the business that's over. Hotels, none of them are operating a profit globally right now. Most of them are shut in the world right now. We're in a very different scenario than we were 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months ago. So if you're in that situation, first, allocate the only projects that are making money or helping people. So crisis response. Ask your staff, are these the right projects, and listen. Attempt to validate that's the right list. Set everyone's expectation. We're going to check this list again next week at the same time on the same Zoom channel or whatever tool you're using. And we're going to do that again every week forever. Set the cadence. Now people can begin to tolerate the rhythm, including yourself. Then invite everyone together and say, here's how much money we're making. Here's the percentage allocated across each of these top priority initiatives. Who wants to work on which initiative? Your salaries are all about to be different. Our income is different. Here's how much money is allocated to each initiative. I need your help to help me justly and fairly allocate these salaries across all of you and the expenses required to propel these projects to done. Salaries are only released when functional pieces are tested that meet the definition of done. So I need you to help me find the definition of done of really small pieces. By this point, hopefully initiative owners are already taking over these components and taking over these conversations. But as an executive leader, you're present, especially if refinancing decisions or reprioritization decisions are being made, which they likely are in real time. So you're being invited back and forth to different Zooms or different video chats is the current real world of this. Then You put everyone through the lightest lift but effective Agile hardware training or software training, depending on what they're building, that you can, marketing training, etc. Because what you need are cross-functional teams that are self-organizing. That way, what this really comes down to is complex adaptive systems. And to do that, we need self-organizing teams with a clear goal and purpose and autonomy. And that creates a highly available system, network of teams. And the reason this is important is what we're seeing around the world now is if in any operation, a COVID test center, an Amazon fulfillment center, a manufacturing line, if we see a trucking dispatch warehouse, if any employee on any shift starts displaying COVID symptoms, high fever, difficulty breathing, it could be an allergic reaction. It could be a flu. We don't know. But if they're displaying COVID symptoms, they're quarantined and tested. And because the tests aren't fully accurate, they have to stay in quarantine. In most countries, this is mandatory already. Italy, this is already law. And they're tested again a week later. So they're off work for a week. But so is anyone else we couldn't prove they weren't in contact with. So in some cases, the entire shift is quarantined for a week, even if no one actually had COVID or tested positive for COVID. And if the shifts overlap, all shifts are quarantined and the entire operation is shut down, even in essential operations. Well, what solves for this? Small, cross-functional, co-located teams. In hardware, sometimes they still need to be co-located. They try to stay 2 meters apart. Now we have shift isolation. So the handoff meetings between shifts are done using a video chat technique or whiteboards that are sanitized and shift notes. Instead of having the overlapping shift meetings that we used to have, which is standard Six Sigma practice. Well, those are now virtual. That way, if someone on a team starts displaying COVID symptoms and needs to be quarantined for a week, yes, their team also needs to be quarantined for a week, but only their team. Because the other teams that shift, they're bounding boxes painted on the ground that have a 2 meter gap, and we have air draft, negative pressure air zones, or we do our best to partition with curtains or plexiglass. This means we have a modular architecture. Now, for these teams to be able to get stuff done, they need to have autonomy. They need to have their own miniature procurement, their own miniature funding, their own miniature hardware design, if it's a hardware product, their own miniature testing, so they can complete work within a sprint within team. And that is the structure Agile teams have been very familiar with for decades. And that's exactly what is becoming, well, for 19 years. And that's exactly what is becoming most robust in a crisis. It turns out this complex adaptive system structure with highly available teams and an active or cloud-based resource model, and for more on that, we'll need a longer session, but it's what some of you are already familiar with, creates the robust system to handle the crisis. And that is the session on executive austerity in a crisis, 38 minutes. And the hardware practices that I would recommend right now for any company in the world to handle this. Now, with that, I'm going to relax a little bit, and I'm going to open up the chat window and stop the share so we can all see each other and see if anybody wants to ask questions. This may or may not be part of the posted recording for the other companies that opted in different time zones, depending on what anyone has or doesn't want to say. Yeah, I am still recording, but I may trim it. We did it. We did it in 38 minutes. Hey, folks, are there any questions?
Hi, Joe. This is Anna Lundqvist from Switzerland.
Hello, Anna. Thank you for staying up late to participate. I'm grateful for it.
Oh, it's not so late. It's 7 o'clock, so I'm still awake.
Oh.
I think this is amazing. And one question that pops into my head is, even though the crisis is so big, how brave are company leaders? you take a couple of very good examples, but how many take these brave initiatives and actually say, yeah, we produce face shields now?
Yeah, most don't. So I think you have seen this as well. I think you'd give the same answer I would. Here's what I'm observing, and I'm not out in companies physically right now either. I'm quarantined.
No.
But looking at LinkedIn, what I've started doing is grading, and it's my own metric, but grading companies' responses by what top leaders are posting on LinkedIn. If they're protecting salaries, they get a B or higher. If they're doing layoffs, they get a C or lower, because they've and sometimes you can't help it, right? Some of these companies legitimately are just blown up and failing, and I get that, but it means they are failing, so they don't get a passing grade. If they're passing, they've protected salaries. They've said, we're not doing layoffs. Typically, that means the executives are taking their own zero salary, and they've suspended all bonuses and all investor payouts, and they've said we're protecting salary of all frontline, of all employees, period. So that's a C or better, or B or better. To get to an A+, they also need to have pivoted to something that actually aids the global community in the response. So that means like Toyota saying, look, people aren't buying cars right now, not almost zero. The market is cratered. Definitely they're not buying gasoline cars. Some electric cars are still being sold, but not that many. Well, that's not true. But anyway, the gasoline car market is blown up. So they say, let's make a product that helps. Let's make face masks. Or Tesla saying, let's invent a ventilator that improves the state of the art. So they get an A+. And I've simply been replying or sharing, both usually, executives' statements of what they're doing with a letter grade. And I would say the vast majority are failing. So it lets me know which companies I want to invest in, which companies I want to work with, and which companies I want to buy products from and support, the ones that are an A+. Now, I don't know if I had anything to do with this, but I did tweet to or LinkedIn to one of the managers at Toyota USA that I'd trained, and said, look, you're not getting an A+. Here's why. You're not pivoting to create products that are supporting the initiative. And his team 2 weeks later posted that they had made the face shields with customer feedback, and 3 weeks later that they'd made the face shield with customer feedback, and now we're in mass production. So I don't know if that was actually triggered by something that a consultant did, but it may have been. So I'd say people like you and I may be able to influence companies around the world to a higher letter grade, if you like the metric that I used, to actually contributing in the crisis, and not just protecting jobs, or in the worst case, leaving people without income in a pandemic.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that creates transparency also.
I'm with you there. It's amazing how these agile values that sound touchy-feely are so important for business survival. How they're actually linked.
And I think the big question is then, will this push high top managers to really try to embrace, for example, Scrum, or is it more ducking and afterwards, yeah, let's try to go back and get back to the usual? Or have their employees changed so much through this experience, it's impossible to go back?
Well, Anna, you're actually one of the people I would really trust your analysis of that question. I've got an opinion, but you've heard me rant for 38 minutes now. I'd like to ask you that question. What do you think from your client base and the companies you're working with and talking to now and recently? What do you think?
It's a good question. In the beginning, I was really, really hopeful, because I saw all these positive signs. Unfortunately, some of the signs are drowning in negative signs right now. So I have been more positive in, wow, this is really going to create a change, because now everybody's experienced home office, for example, and the freedom of it. And my husband, he's an R&D engineer for ABB. and the whole team is working from home office, and they do type testing at the lab, and they have the minimal amount of people at the lab doing it there, and the rest of the team is remote. And they are every day learning more and more how to do it. And I also see this enthusiasm of the freedom, and also creating better infrastructures and better ways of documenting and learning and better ways of communicating, etc. And that will stay. And ABB gets a side benefit of they can do testing in any lab anywhere in the world without sending a team afterwards. So of course that is going to have an effect. And I really hope that the big majority of people also sort of push their managers, and that the managers themselves also get this positive experience. Wow, my team really performed during this time. I mean, my husband's team, they even say they perform better now than before. It's amazing, right? And that experience, when people experience it, you can't take it away from them. It's like then you want to go back to that and not be stuck in the old structure anymore. So I really hope for that force to be strong. But at the same time, you have Trumps and Putins and yeah, a lot of leaders pulling in a different way.
Well, to that point, I just recently saw a study result saying only 9% of UK citizens want to go back to the way work was before.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And if it's only 9%, there may be a step change. The opportunity is going to be software groups have been doing this for 19 years, some of them much longer, some of them 30 years. Mm-hmm. The challenge will be having good information taken up by the organizations that are reinventing themselves continuously right now. One of the issues is a lot of the people that became really familiar with the pros and cons of agility and how to do it, consultants, trainers, coaches, coders, a lot of them are viewed as and are really a luxury expense. So in a crisis, they're not being bought. So that means the knowledge repositories need to be the ones that are going to be used, which are really cheap ones. Maybe books. Maybe we need some better books out there right now. I'm not sure. I'm shooting in the dark here, but it's where people going to get their information, really where are they actually going to go to get their information as they're rebuilding themselves now and whenever the new normal comes around in 1 month or 18 months or 36 months, I don't know. When that happens, where are people going to get their information? Because a lot of them aren't going to be in the position to hire a bunch of excellent top grade global consulting teams. So where are they going to get their information? Otherwise, they might end up reinventing some stuff that's been tried 10 years ago, 12 years ago, and was found to be not the best path. And that's not the end of the world either. But I think this is the opportunity, is how to get the information where it's going to be used. The Harvard Business Review article by Daryl Rigby and the team at Bain, the Agile C Suite, I was just reading it before this seminar started. I think a lot of people will get it. And it has some structural problems. It has some really good stuff. I have respect for Daryl and that team professionally, but there's some structural problems. I was just writing an analysis of that article right now, because a lot of people are going to use that article as a template to rebuild, because our subscriptions are not that expensive. And it's a lot cheaper than bringing in a team from McKinsey or Boston Consulting Group or you or I. So here is suspected problems. I'm not all the way through. But first, the Agile C Suite team in that article doesn't run the events or roles of a Scrum team. They don't have any roles or events. Well, how to avoid the problems this creates in any Agile team that doesn't have any roles or events? Because we've seen that, and it's suboptimal. It's actually a train wreck. And that's what's recommended by this article. So that's not going to perform well. So we need to get counter information out there. Second, budgeting replanning is quarterly with a possible increase in cadence. That's a 3-month-long sprint. How to avoid the problems a 3-month-long sprint creates in any Agile team. And that's information you and I are familiar with, but this article, which is what people are going to read, they won't know that that's a problem. They'll say, oh, well, good, a 3-month sprint. Then there's
and in their ears, it will sound short because they compare it to their 2-year sprint.
If Tesla and Toyota had done that, they still would have had zero action because COVID was less than 3 months ago. Zero. If the New York City hospital system had done that, the death toll would be what, 100x what it is now? If the Italian government had done that now, like this is a known bad pattern, but this is what's in, and there's good stuff in that article too. But if someone isn't able to put that information in a forum that people are going to use, it's going to be lost. So I'm intrigued, Anna, what you might suggest, because you do this professionally as well, and I'd love to help companies skip some bad steps and prevent a few more companies from going out of business.
Yeah, it's a good question. And right now I find it really, really hard to reach people. I can only reach them on a personal level, sort of how are you personally dealing with this chaos, rather than reaching them on a professional level. And that worries me a bit because that needs to shift also. It's like a lot of business leaders in Switzerland are still in this personal panic mode. And that doesn't help taking brave decisions and saying, let's try something different now. So yeah, it's a very good question. And I also, because what I work with in everyday life, it's not agile. I went to your course because I wanted to understand more of it, and I also realized there are very many connections to what I work with. And it's helping companies building an infrastructure to have a common goal, and having this cross-functional cooperation that you talk about. You talk about it in mini teams, but if you have a large organization like ABB with 100,000 employees, you can't have only mini teams. You have to reach this on a big scale also for large companies, and how to do that. So that is what I'm doing. But a lot of the principles like transparency, and I just love it when you say you don't fire people, because that is going to hurt you so much. You rather say, this is how much we earn right now and how do we deal with it. And that is going to create the creativity for new ideas, etc. And that is also exactly what we're trying to come to, and also the autonomy of all the teams. I don't know if you're familiar of the living self-organizing process. It's a physical term, but you can use it for teams also. How do you get teams to work really well together? And using that model to support team leaders to get your team to be really a high-performing team, for example. That's what we do. And we always start with the CEO when we do this.
I haven't.
Because if the CEO is not on board, and that's why I also realized the problem that Agile and Scrum have. If it starts from the bottom, you come to a certain stage where it's maybe divisional leaders or department leaders. They don't really believe in this, but they say, yeah, you can do it, but we won't do it. And that is such a killer for creating a new culture in the company. So
wow. And the I wrote down the name, living self-organizing process. Those are all words that I use all the time from different academic studies. However, quote, living self-organizing process, quote, I've not heard of that. So I will look it up. I've just added that to my backlog. Thank you for that, Anna. Yeah.
What did I think of? I wanted to ask something more, but yeah, no, I wanted to thank you actually, because when we met, we got the message that the schools were closing on Monday.
Yeah.
In Switzerland. So that meant my 8-year-old son was home, and he was supposed to do his schoolwork from home.
Yes.
And we got dumped with this, being the teachers of our son. And we also have a smaller daughter. She's not at school. And 1.5 weeks, we really struggled with his motivation, and he thought this really sucked. And it was absolutely horrible, and I fell into command and control a lot. And then after 1.5 weeks, I thought to myself, okay, I went to this great course. Why don't I try to make a Scrum board for him and see if that works instead? And it did. And he loves it. And we are at peace with one another. And I've sent the instruction to the teacher, and she's spreading it at school and spreading it to the parents, because she thinks this is so great, and involving the kids in choosing what they do, etc. So it was so funny. Thank you very much, Joe. It was great.
Anna, I'm privileged to be the conduit. I'm so grateful. But let me give credit. So that's Willy Wynyards in the Netherlands, who put together EduScrum. Now I use it too with my 6-year-old and 3-year-old. I love it. But
Great.
I will give credit
Yeah.
to Willy. So I'm happy to share what Willy's building. Then in the U.S. there's someone, he's Swiss. But he's in the U.S. He's actually in Switzerland now, and he can't get out because of the lockdown. But he's been working in the U.S.
Okay.
on EduScrum.
Oh.
Christian Wandeler.
Okay.
But Anna, it seems you've created a revolution in the school system your children are in, and I'm so grateful for this. I hope
Yeah,
that,
in this little village at least. So
that's what it takes. That's how it starts.
yeah, that's true. So thank you very much, Joe. Thank you for a great session.
Oh, you're too kind. I'll post a recording on YouTube shortly for the companies that requested this in the Asia time zone. Thank you so much.
Okay. So can I get that recording too? Because I want to show this to my colleagues. I think this is really showing the essence of what you can do with Agile and Scrum. And they don't really understand it. So they sort of say, yeah, what is that? Sort of.
Of course. The YouTube link, I will share it with all the folks who registered, and I'll tweet it as well. So if
perfect.
you follow @JoeJustice0 on Twitter, you'll get it.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you, Anna. Message anytime.
Thank you.
Stay healthy, stay safe.
Yeah, you too. Bye-bye.